Hello everyone, Clocks here. We have finally tackled Gleba, and this is my new agricultural science blade. As you can see, it is a monster setup that produces the equivalent of 4 full belts of science with additional overhead to account for freshness. It makes 66,000 per minute per blade. Remember that 58,000 is 4 belts, so you got 8,000 overhead per minute. And the production of this blade gets to be this high because we are running basically biochambers fully beaconed non-stop, direct insert via cars, and each chamber has 2 dedicated silos allocated to it, and they are going more or less non-stop. It is a blade that is aggressively clocked, and there's no bot use except if you somehow cut the inputs or stop requesting science somehow, and then the pentapods could eventually rebel. But this is the only thing that the roboports are really here for. Incidentally, it's also what the Tesla turrets are for, but we are getting ahead of ourselves. So in short, this is a huge Megabase level agricultural blade. It optimizes for performance, but more importantly ergonomics of operating something that has violent failure modes. Because this is Gleba, we want things to not get stuck permanently, and so there's a bunch of bootstrap and recovery features baked in here. So I hope this will be somewhat useful to some of you. So let's get through it. So let's do a quick overview over the way the blade functions. So let's look at the bit that is copied the most, and that's basically going to be this science unit here. Because the science part of the blade is basically 8 identical rows containing a this and a mirror version of itself. So there's a total of 16 science biochambers in this blade that is making science, running at the maximum possible 68.9 per second. And that is basically enough for 2 rocket launches every 29 seconds, so it's basically an almost perfect use of these launchers. But it turns out that doing it this way requires a lot of inputs. You basically need a pair of 2 7-beaconed egg chambers constantly going to feed it. As you can see, this has a requirement of 27.5 eggs per second, and each of these produce 19.7, which sounds like a lot, but then you account for the amount it takes to feed itself. You're down to just over 14 per second production, and that's just barely over the requirement. So that's why it's so crammed in here. We're kind of abusing this car's hitbox to make it work. And there's a clear trade-off to this, because it makes the blueprint build order dependent. So it's going to come as a 2-stage blueprint where cars, inserters, and beacons are placed in a specific order to ensure that the inserters target the right thing. Now on to egg production. Each egg chamber has its own dedicated nutrient machine because it needs more than 120 nutrients per second, and thus you're going to need 2 stack inserters taking care of that. So that means you also need 2 of them. And these also need to keep themselves alive, so they bounce nutrient between each other through this car here. This is perhaps one of the more disgusting parts of this build, because you have this inserter here which is going out into the car, and then you have these 2 going back in. Obviously the car itself is filtered with just a single slot of nutrients and a single slot of spoilage. So this thing should in theory never spoil, because you're always putting the fresh stuff on top of this, so the freshness is average with that. I kind of like to think of it as like this infinite sourdough starter. It's never quite able to spoil. But like this would of course be a lot easier if the machines were right next to each other, because then you just have inserters bounce back and forth. But this is the way it is because you need a 7th beacon here to get the egg chambers fully set up. Now onto the mess of wires that is here. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but basically every inserter here has some clock associated with it. This is what the blade looks like with wake lists on. The science is going, as you can see, full blast, and everything is smooth, and there's very little extraneous activity here. The way the clocks are working is that the science lab itself is doing lead follower through these constant combinators here, snaking their way up on the side of the blade. And the lead follower clocks are down here at the bottom left at the lead biochamber. And you can see the output, the input, the other input. This input is a little special because it has two things that it's pulling out of the car, so that you can see that's doing a set filter on this inserter here. And that's actually propagated to this inserter and this inserter in a kind of unique way. We're actually using this combinator here to filter out the pentapod signal so that this thing gets to swing whenever these guys get to do the swing. So like this row here is all synchronized to that. And these have to be programmed kind of separately because this has special spoilage handling. And then about spoilage handling, there's also a bunch of spoilage inserters here. That's all on this big red network. These are almost fully off because under normal circumstances no spoilage is really produced in the main part of the blade. I will get back to this. But in the meantime, the last clocks is basically everything that's going to be on the green wire here. And these are all dedicated for periodic tick signals for basically everything else. Numbers that have been found by observing the system under load and just giving it minimal slack, which means that whatever you see here is not a perfect system by any means, but it is simple. And simple was kind of desirable for me here because I feel like I blew my complexity budget on this horrific layout here. So what we have is effectively these 5 clocks down here by the head. They're all kind of documented within what they do. But in short, there's a flux input clock that controls whenever this swings, like every 110 ticks. There is a pentapod. This is nutrient self-feeding. That's basically for whenever these guys take stuff out of the car to self-feed, only with a stack size of 8, because they don't really need a lot of nutrients to keep going. Then there's a car insert clock. That's basically whenever this guy is putting things into the car, it just needs to not. This car needs to not starve because it's also used by the science input. And so this is kind of one of the downsides of using cars, because you can't measure what's actually inside of them. So you just have to be a little over. That's why sometimes you see this as hanging here. On the other side here, we have the 2 pentapod clocks. We have the nutrient clock on the left here, which is like basically a 3 swing cycle, and it has a little break. It works pretty well. And then you have the pentapod exchange clock, which is a very optimistic type setup. Basically, you have to try and get these inserters to try and exchange some pentapod eggs a little more frequently than it actually needs, because these guys are not exactly tuned with the output of this. And it's kind of bad because you need to avoid starving the machine, but you also need to avoid output blocking it. So it seems you have to be quite over-optimistic on multiple sides here. Like we have to even read each of these machines here just to make sure you don't starve it by checking that there's enough in the output. And even though you read each machine, you can't even distinguish between the input and the output if you want to do 2 different style of clocks. So like the information from reading the machine can only really help one of them. So this particular clock is kind of best effort here. If anyone can come up with something better for pentapod eggs, I'd be happy to hear it. But like maybe the solution is that you just have to throttle the science production so that it aligns perfectly with pentapod egg production instead, because then everything could in theory become deterministic. But this is not something I've tried. Now moving down to the head of the blade, we have the bioflux production. Notice that the science area is basically only taking bioflux as input, and we are producing basically 3 full belts of it under normal operations. We have a full belt going to each sides for each science output, and then we have basically 2 half belts going up the center for nutrient consumption. So there's a fairly aggressive head here to make this amount of bioflux. Like this whole head here can in theory make up to 4 full belts, but the blade is scaled to the capacity of the outer belts, and consequently the inner ones are scaled down. You can see there's some gaps here. Notice there's actually only half the inserters on the bioflux machines that go to the inner lane compared to the ones that are going to the science flux. And that's kind of important because the flux belt that goes to science is much more important than the other one, because the freshness of this bioflux impacts the freshness of the science itself. As you can see, it's coming out of this machine with over 98% freshness. And if we look at how that works up here, that gets averaged with the freshness of the pentapod eggs, which are should always be near perfect, and that means that the science gets to leave from here with just under 99%. And to accomplish this, these machines here have some very aggressively throttling of the input inserters. It's basically using Koenig's conditions that he has for his input throttling. Basically 12 at a time, make sure that's less than 24 in the machine, and for the mash it's less than 30 in the machine and 15 at a time. And you can see that basically keeps the machine going non-stop, and at the same time there's not that much in here, and that's important because you see these guys can actually stack up to, let's compare to this, to like 200 in the insertion limit, and then things are just going to tick down very quickly. Like you can easily lose like 1% or 2% of freshness in just these bioflux machines by themselves, and that's kind of crazy because that's like more than the freshness drop you'd expect from the whole blade. And then the remaining outputs, basically the blue belts is just a joined thing for waste products, spoilage and seeds. The spoilage makes its way up to the only recycler pair that we have in this blade, and then the seeds are belted out to the front for you to hook up to whatever seed management system that you may use. So that was a very quick overview of how the blade works in the optimal setup. But because this is Gleba, I think it's also important that we address the suboptimal path, because Gleba is an extremely fickle planet. There are so many more failure points here than on any other planet, as spoilage can clog up pretty much every machine slot, be it inputs or outputs. It can clog up belts, clogs up inserter hands, silos, cars, so you kind of need a special handling of it everywhere. And the machines themselves need to be bootstrapped with nutrients and eggs, and if for some reason your thing stops, then you need to do this bootstrapping again. So you kind of need to have continuous throughput for this to work. But then you have the agricultural towers kind of working against you because they don't produce consistent throughput, they produce throughput based on your planting time. And then you have a whole kind of complicated seed management and planting dance that you have to constantly do to ensure everything is stable. And of course, you learn to handle these problems, but it's the type of problems whose symptoms you only notice half a day later. And it's this type of uniquely challenging setup here that I think why so many people are a bit put off by Gleba. Because one does not simply travel to Gleba to make a few tweaks. You have to plan to monitor the planet for like days after. So with that in mind, there are a couple of things I do not want to compromise for in a Gleba design. And the first one is that everything should have spoilage handling. As you can see, I have spoilage outserters of everything here. And because, like, under ideal circumstances, as I was saying, these should not be used. And in those cases, they are a waste of UPS. But if you screw up anything, and you will find yourself running around like a headless chicken, picking out hundreds of inserters from each machine, and that gets tiring real fast. And while it does somehow impact the way you can build, you see I need slots for it everywhere, kind of awkward in some places. This one is taking spoilage out of the car. You can still clearly get max beaconing on science and still have full spoilage handling. And it really shouldn't cost you any performance to do this. Because if you set it up carefully so that if you rely that under normal circumstances no spoilage is produced, you can effectively clock these spoilage inserters so that they are only on for a very small period of time. Like for me, that means a 30-second clock. And I have benchmarked having this clock running versus not having any spoilage inserters at all, and it basically showed me 0 difference. So they can be cheap, but are they actually useful at that stage? Because, like, can they actually help you recover if they only do a swing every 30 seconds? And that leads me to my second requirement. If you fuck something up, there should be an option for you to flush all the spoilage. Because if you've broken an input line for like more than 5 minutes, you've likely backed up the biochambers completely, and you're going to produce spoilage faster than these inserters are going to take it out. Therefore, the switch there I just showed you is doing that, and I'll show you a full recovery cycle on this later. But for now, just take a look at the wake lists of these spoilage inserters when they are unclocked effectively now as a result of me turning on the switch. And like I actually did a benchmark when I accidentally left this switch on, and I got an immediate 5% performance drop. So like this, that's how much this matters. And a final requirement, everything should have bootstrap functionality. Because I don't want to be running around putting nutrients into every machine that is making nutrients from bioflux, and I don't want to be hand inserting pentapod eggs. So that's why there's this nutrient bootstrap switch here, which is going to activate this inserter and send nutrients down through this bootstrap lane here. It's also going to be activating these inserters, this red inserter and this blue inserter, that are both putting things into the car. This is a system that you're intended to use the first time you set up a blade, and it's the only component in the blade that is actually using red and blue inserters. To bootstrap this machine here, I mean, either you can do this one manually because it's the center one, but there is also a circuit for it. If you have this on the network, this will request it from the network. If it hadn't had it for a while, you can also make it kind of permanent while you're doing this. But yeah, that's for nutrients. Now for the final bootstrap, pentapod eggs, this one is a little different, because if you look at the egg chambers here, there's basically no room here to do any egg input insertion. Alright, unless you took this bot and started programming this inserter to also do spoilage handling, which would be kind of horrible. But I think this is actually kind of okay, because if pentapods are hatching on you, something is definitely wrong with your setup, and you probably don't want to just be having your system indefinitely keep feeding pentapods to your Tesla turrets. So the bootstrap for pentapods is effectively a blueprint instead. It is this. You can see it's 4 biochambers. You can drag it across, and it's going to put a one-time RoboPort request for pentapod eggs into the system. So I will show how to set this up and how to use it and what the recovery process looks like. But before I do, I have a couple of caveats here, because if you do plan on taking this and using it, you should plan for this blade to be running more or less non-stop, even if Navi's does not use Gleba signs, with like at most a few minutes of inactivity to avoid spoilage building up. Personally, I recommend having 3 or 4 ships to optimize freshness and do very minimal loads of signs, and have that set up before you try to install this personally, and then you can just crush it at the end of the labs at Navi's. But I mean, you can achieve a similar safety just to make sure that this guy is running all the time by having some kind of recycler system at the end, pulling stuff out of the silos or something like that. You have to bake in some own circuitry for it. But effectively, you have to keep the science production running, because once the eggs are in these machines here, they either get turned into a product or they hatch, and you don't want the latter. And if this blade waits for more than 5 minutes, spoilage is going to back up, and normally this needs some button pressing to recover. But if it backs up for more than 15 minutes, then that's again where things get violent. Because effectively we have cars here as an additional hop for eggs. So that means we're going to have a bigger buffer of eggs than many other blades. We actually, on each row here, you can in theory have up to 200 eggs in various buffers and hands and stuff. So that means in the worst case, like this blade can have close to 2,000 pentapods spawning at you at the same time. And that's not pretty. Well, actually it's a little pretty, but it's wise to plan for the eventuality. And my choice here is the more aggressive option, with a large row of Tesla turrets here as my insurance. This is 2 full rows of Q5 Teslas on each side, which cost some power, but because of the aforementioned building placement order, I don't want to risk anything dying. You are also going to need a fair amount of fruit inputs to deal with this. Like this one blade here is fed by this field here, which is running with 31 Yumako trees on fairly good plants. And then there's this dedicated ones for jelly nuts. This is 12 towers, and that would be sufficient. I'm using basically a 1 lane to 4 splitter and a 2 lane to 4 splitter, and if this ever backs up, then that gets crushed. You don't want this belt to become stagnant, so this is basically the only small area in the blade where fruits get to wait a little bit on the blade, and it's only for a few seconds. I also highly recommend you use Koenig's agricultural clock, because that's why you see all of my throughput is uniform. It's all following the same pattern, because it's this subtick clock that is developed here that makes this come out at a perfect ratio. So we are in the editor. This makes it kind of easy to show the bootstrap and recovery by modifying time, and we can also skip the farming setup. So we're showing how to use the book and how to do the setup. So this is the stage 1 of the blueprint. It's got most of the stuff. It's skipping some beacons, it's skipping a car. Let's hook it up. First of all, let's do rocket parts on the side. I'm just going to force place that because it normally comes on the side for me. I'm going to do the fruits on the center part here. And then I'm going to do water at the top. This is really just one infinity pipe, but that's what it is. This is also doing power. It's also putting some nutrients in an active provider chest. So let's use the nutrient bootstrap thing to make sure that comes in there. I'm just going to make that permanent while I'm testing this. And that's it. So now we have nutrients kind of starting to go. Once this belt fills up, actually let's do this 2x. Then it can start feeding itself by grabbing from here. Like once we start getting there. Okay, now we have all of this going. So I can take all of this out. I can start putting bootstrap nutrients down the center of the blade. I should also place down part 2 to get the nutrient cars and the remaining beacons. And I'm also going to put eggs into all of the machines. So that should be doing that. As you can see, these guys are already going. Is everything going? Yeah, it's almost. It takes a little while because everyone is leeching off the same setup. So yeah, now these guys are going, now these guys are going. So let's just wait for this to fully stabilize. Let's watch the output and turn up the time. And this should all be shooting up towards 66,000 per minute, which is what we have now. Right, so that is the setup part. This part is easy. Now let's make it a little interesting. Let's show what actually happens when you get blocked. I can simulate this in many ways. Let me just cut the input belt so that there's suddenly no, it's like kind of simulating cutting the fruits or something. I'm just cutting bioflux right now. So now we can just wait and see. We've had 5 minutes of time. Let's wait a little bit more. Okay, 6 minutes. That's just like the minimum. Now we have spoilage in here. And for that to recover, if we notice it by then, we can just turn on the spoilage thing. You see a ton of spoilage is making its way out. Unfortunately, there may also be spoilage on some of these central belts, as you can see here. And to do that, you actually have to pulse this thing here. You can see that changes the filter on the center one, and that makes some more stuff come out. And that should be enough to handle a small hiccup. Let's watch that recover. That usually recovers quite quickly. Yeah, so that's back already. But that is much more simple. Let's see what happens in the worst case. Let's do a full kind of disaster setup. Let me just make it horrible for the first time. So I'm going to turn up the speed massively, 64x. You can see time fly by, and you can see the pentapods literally spoiling as time goes by. 7 minutes, 6 minutes, 5 minutes. Right, so in a short amount of time, this is going to be a big problem because we have very little safety right now. What are we on? We are on to 1 minute, 1:16. Right, you're going to see this is going to be a big problem right now because there's only a couple of Tesla turrets. So let's see what we got. I left the spoilage on, but that doesn't really matter because you have nothing to account for the spoilage of the eggs, which is going to hatch in literally 3 seconds. So here we are. And you can see this is not pretty. Like, this is a ton of things, and we lost a significant amount of stuff here. So let's try and not do it this way. So let's try and deal with this a little bit better. Let's first turn off all of the safety functionality, like this is not needed when it's running normally. And then let's go to the spaceship, this very synthetic test that I have, just constantly pulling. Now we're no longer pulling, which means that the science is going to back up in the silos, it's going to back up in the cars, it's going to back up in here, and it's going to eventually spoil in like an hour, but way before then, the pentapod eggs are going to hatch, and that's the real problem case. So let's ensure that we have a little more safety against it than last time. So let's put a bunch of Tesla turrets down on the side. And let's turn up the time and wait for it to happen. See, the 5-minute mark has passed already, because that means now we have spoilage. I could turn on the spoilage thing to clear that out, but you can see every 30 seconds at least something goes out. But, you know, not enough to keep up. But now we are approaching that time. 50 seconds, 40 seconds. Yeah, so let's turn this down so we can see this more or less real time. And you can see now it's pretty much keeping up. You can see a lot of things are damaged here. You can see a lot of notifications, but we got no yellow notifications. Like nothing actually got destroyed, as you can see. And that's kind of what we wanted, because last time we lost tons of stuff. So have we actually fixed it? Well, of course not, because we've lost all the eggs. So let's show how you would actually fix it in this case. Let's turn on the bootstrap. Let's turn on the spoilage handling. You can see now there's going to be a huge amount of spoilage being vacated out of all of the machines on this central belt. And this isn't even going to be enough, because you can see there's also spoilage on this belt. So once this belt is getting a little free, I'm also going to pulse this to flicker get that through the car and back through the belt, and eventually that should back up. Right, so that's most of it. Of course, we don't have any eggs, so I'm going to put that back in. So I'll drag this blueprint over once again, and then shortly this should start up again, but there might still be some spoilage. I'm going to flush this a couple of extra times to see if anything more appears. Otherwise, let's see, what do we got? Let's turn up time, because now it should fix itself. Why? Oh yeah, of course. We also need to start pulling signs, because otherwise we'll have the same problem again. So let's see if that fixes it. But now we might have more spoilage, so let me clear out the belts one again. But hopefully that wasn't enough time for the pentapods to hatch. We were running at 16x, so it's sometimes time passes very quickly. But I think we fixed it. As you can see, everything seems to be operational. Let's compare against the output. It's not fully recovered yet. So let's go and flush some more spoilage just in case. I saw a big blob moving down here. And there it is. Now it sometimes takes a few minutes to fully stabilize again because of the lead follower, but it does eventually settle. So as you can see, this is the benefit of having this type of safety. Fixing the blade becomes like a minute job with a few clear steps, just flicking a couple of inserters, flicking a couple of buttons every now and then, rather than have to look at all the machines and grab spoilage under time pressure. Because, like, remember, while the time is passing, and you're looking for machines to fix, other machines are producing spoilage even though you might have just cleared it out. So yeah, this is stuff I'm very happy to have automated out. Now finally on to benchmarks, because UPS wise this is performing really well. I have benchmarked it against Koenig's very optimized blueprint, and then an optimized variant of Hobbit's blades, which is this is basically Hobbit's blade, but like with belted rocket parts and a little better spoilage handling. I'm basically sending spoilage back out on the side, but otherwise things are more or less as before. And but the short conclusion is basically that this setup here, with benchmarking against this Hobbit style blade, I'm getting a 30% UPS improvement from switching away from this blade, which is what I was using. And the reason I think this blade is like much worse than mine is it's got significant bot usage even after optimization. It's also got, like, all of these spoilage inserters are much more heavily clocked. You can see that these are constantly pinged. And also the head is kind of fairly aggressive for the amount of science being produced. Like, it's not much smaller than mine, and yet, like, I need 5 blades to do what 2 of mine can do. Then the second blade I benchmarked is conages, because that's kind of the real competition here. This is much more focused on performance. It is a quite hardcore blade. If I go down to an individual unit here, you can see that he has basically no spoilage inserters at all. So it's quite an intimidating blueprint to set up. But it is true what it says. Like, once you get this thing working, it does just work. You don't technically need the safety most of the time. So it's a great design, and that is 100% stable when used right. So I'll link to his video for this below. As for the actual UPS comparison of this, the comparison I was doing was 265,000 science per second. So I have 3 of his blades, and he came out like 1% better than mine. So your mileage may vary, but this is certainly a very tight result between 2 very different designs. So, like, I can speculate a little bit on why this is. Like, Konage has almost twice the amount of science biolabs to achieve the same thing, but he has 6% fewer launchers. So, entity-wise, I think that probably works in my favor. But on the other hand, Konage doesn't need to daisy chain any eggs or any nutrients, so that means he needs less stuff to do the same. So it's less an entity activity there. So that definitely works in his favor. And then spoilage inserters, I was saying, like, I benchmarked that. It doesn't make any difference at all, even though he doesn't have them. So like, given this result, like how tightly this performed compared to mine, I'm sure there are multiple approaches here that are going to be performing very similarly, given that you are optimizing it well. So we are back in the base. Let's talk about freshness and scaling, because the way I have integrated them here in my base is that I have 2 of them, and these export to navis, and then gets shunted into the labs via this horrible belt spaghetti, but it's 4 belts on each side that gets fully used. There's also kind of a top-up belt that snakes its way on the side here, not quite a full belt. And it shunts its way halfway down the labs to kind of the midpoint, a little past the midpoint, I believe, and then we have these clocked inserters that are just topping up the belt kind of horribly. And this is just one way of doing this type of stuff. Everyone ultimately feels the Gleba freshness tax the same way. I'm doing it this way because I have these enormously long arrays for Promethean science, and that's kind of what my base is designed for. But it does mean that I can very easily now just look at what my freshness is, what it should be, by kind of looking at what my consumption is. So if I go to Navi's consumption and I look at Agri, I can see I'm at 125,480. So that is what I need to produce effectively. I know that I'm producing 132,000 from 2 blades, 66,000 times 2. But let's see how much that actually is. So 125,480. If I divide that by 60 per second and divide it by 240, this is the amount of belts that I'm actually consuming of agricultural science. And if I divide it by 8, this is going to be my overproduction. So 8.9% overproduction is what I need. And I also can do 1 over that and 1 over that, and I will see the average freshness in my labs, which should be 92%. So I should be able to go kind of to the midpoint, should be around here, and I can check in a lab, and you can see, yeah, there's roughly that. Maybe I went too close. So this does mean that the blade is slightly overscaled for me. So I'm like 125 to 132. It means I'm almost 7k over. So back on Gleba, this means I can almost kill like a full row up here, but not quite, because a full row would be 8k. So what I've effectively done is I've just kind of disabled 2 inserters up here. So I'm just killed 1 quadrant. That takes out 4,000. If I made a third blade, I could kill a full row. So like how much you can, or if even at all you can disable something, depends on how good your freshness is. Some overproduction is ultimately fine, but ultimately it's just like science you throw out at the edge of space. Like see here, this is what happens. At the end, if Novice doesn't need it, there should only be 1,000 or 2 that gets thrown overboard here on the way back. So I don't really have any clear next steps here. This is as far as my investigation has gone. The comparison with Koenig's blade is close enough that I'm personally just going to be prioritizing what I think is cool over the last percentage of performance, particularly because I now have a blade that can handle failures. It's easy to install, operates in multiples of 4 lanes, it's kind of nice to scale in Megabases. But as usual, if you do have suggestions that can improve things, I would love to hear them. All of the designs from these videos have linked blueprints, so please leave comments if you are using any of this stuff. In the meantime, my name is Klux, and this is the Pentapod Revolution.